In recent days, a 28-point peace plan presented by the administration of President Donald Trump to end the Ukraine-Russia war seems to favor the cat instead of the canary. Ukrainian and European leaders have expressed consternation at many of the terms of the plan, which they consider to be capitulation to Russia's maximalist demands. One of the most controversial clauses in the plan is the one that states that Ukraine will enshrine in its constitution that it will not join NATO, and that NATO agrees to include in its statutes a provision that Ukraine will not be admitted in the future. The issue of Ukraine joining NATO has been at the heart of the conflict in Ukraine long before Russia launched its invasion in February 2022. And as the issue's inclusion in the 28-point plan demonstrates, it remains a critical aspect of ending the conflict, however that ultimately unfolds. Ukraine's possible acceptance into NATO has stirred up a lively debate for decades, with prominent voices making compelling cases both for and against. But what would happen if Ukraine were to join NATO today? Let's unpack the expected consequences, the pros and cons of taking this step, and how likely Ukraine's accession to NATO actually is. For starters, let's be under no illusions that Ukraine's admission to NATO in the short term is extremely unlikely. There are several compelling, and at least for now, seemingly insurmountable issues in the way. The most tangible of those issues is that NATO has strict and comprehensive requirements for admitting nations into the alliance, and while it has made substantial progress in meeting those requirements, in certain key areas, Ukraine still has some way to go. NATO membership requires firm proof of democratic governance, which is not possible at present, mostly due to the ongoing war. Democratic governance hinges on regular, free, and fair democratic elections, which Ukraine hasn't held since 2019, when Volodymyr Zelensky was elected president. Martial law was declared on February 24, 2022, immediately following Russia's full-scale invasion, and it's been extended every 90 days since then, most recently until February 3, 2026. According to Ukrainian law, no elections can take place under martial law. Thus, until martial law is lifted, Ukraine can't meet the specific NATO requirement. Deep-rooted corruption in Ukraine has also been widely cited as a stumbling block to meeting NATO's government's requirements for membership. As highlighted in a 2024 article in Foreign Policy, entitled "Ukraine is Still Too Corrupt to Join the West," and more recently by a major scandal involving Zelensky's inner circle, compared to most NATO members, corruption in Ukraine remains endemic and rampant. Top judges, politicians, and officials have faced corruption charges, and the Ministry of Defense has been at the heart of corruption scandals such as procuring overpriced eggs and winter jackets, buying 100,000 mortar shells that were never delivered, or accepting bribes from men who wanted to escape conscription. It took mass public protest to force Zelensky's government to drop a controversial law that would have greatly reduced the independence of Ukraine's two supposedly independent anti-corruption organizations, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU, and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, SAPO. A few months later, the same NABU was uncovering epic corruption among Zelensky's closest allies. It's true that the sterling work done by NABU to uncover the so-called Mindich Gate scandal, involving energy sector corruption worth at least $100 million by Zelensky confidant Timur Mindich and many other top officials, speaks to Ukraine's efforts to combat corruption even at the highest levels. However, what they've revealed so far, believed to be the tip of the iceberg, also speaks to just how difficult a task it's going to be to bring corruption levels down to NATO standards. Ukraine has also faced criticism for the banning of opposition political parties since Russia invaded. In May 2022, President Zelensky signed a law enabling the suspension of parties accused of justifying or colluding with Russian aggression. This led to the banning of 11 parties, including the largest opposition group, Opposition Platform for Life, OPZZH, which had advocated for closer ties with Russia. While the government justified these actions under martial law as necessary for national security, organizations like Freedom House have expressed concern over the growing concentration of power and restrictions on political pluralism. Another as yet unresolved issue is that NATO requires new members to align their defensive institutions with its norms, including transparent procurement and civilian oversight. The Strategic Defense Procurement Review, implemented by NATO, aims to bring Ukraine's procurement in line with Euro-Atlantic standards. However, Ukraine's legacy Soviet systems and the difficulties of trying to implement the process in the midst of a brutal war have slowed full compliance, and full integration of Ukraine's intelligence and cyber defense structures with NATO remains a work in progress. That's important because full military interoperability with NATO is another requirement for membership. Since at least 2014, following the post-Maidan breakout of civil war in Donbass and Russia's annexation of Crimea, Ukraine has rapidly modernized its armed forces, adopting NATO standards in training, command structures, and equipment with significant Western support. The 2023 NATO-Ukraine Concept for Interoperability Framework integrates NATO standards into Ukraine's long-term defense planning. However, full interoperability, the ability to operate seamlessly with NATO forces, is still some way from complete. Key gaps included outdated Soviet-era logistics systems, incomplete integration of secure communications, and the need for sustained reform in defense procurement and personnel management. Again, it's practically impossible for Ukraine to fully implement this program while it's at war, a fact that in and of itself represents the biggest hurdle to Ukraine's accession to NATO. While not a formal criterion, the active war with Russia is a de facto barrier to NATO membership. There is no explicit rule in NATO's membership criteria that prohibits a country currently engaged in a conflict from joining the alliance. The open door policy established under Article 10 of the NATO Treaty states that any European state in a position to further the principles of the treaty and contribute to the security of the North Atlantic area may be invited to join, provided that all current members unanimously agree to the invitation. However, accession to NATO also requires the unanimous consent of all 32 member states. Any single member can block ascension for political reasons, even if the applicant meets the criteria, as demonstrated when Turkey and Hungary delayed Sweden's accession to NATO over unrelated political disputes. And there's one glaring reason why, all else being equal, several NATO members have huge concerns about admitting Ukraine to NATO while it's at war: NATO's Article 5 Mutual Defense Clause. The clause requires all members to treat an attack on one as an attack on all. As such, if Russian drone and missile attacks continue to swarm nightly through Ukrainian skies, and the Russian army continued advancing along the front lines after Ukraine's admission, all the other NATO members would de facto find themselves at war with Russia. And while many NATO members in word and deed have made no secret of their willingness to support Ukraine's fight against Russia to the last Ukrainian, there's little evidence that most of them have any appetite for risking body bags of their own citizens. So far, no NATO country has committed physical boots-on-the-ground combat forces to Ukraine. There's been a copious supply of equipment, training, volunteers from NATO countries and so on, but no direct involvement, at least officially. But would that change if Ukraine was suddenly to be fast-tracked into NATO, with war still raging on its territory? If this were to happen in a few years, 2028 to 2030, there's a high likelihood that a number of the more militarily powerful NATO members, primarily UK, France, Germany and Poland, would be ready to enter the fray directly. That's assuming the massive European rearmament and military preparedness programs set in motion in 2025 meet their objectives, and NATO, particularly on its eastern flank, is thus far better prepared for a broader conflict with Russia. With the dramatically ramped-up number of forces and advanced equipment, logistics, and coordination that these plans envisage, NATO forces could potentially open synchronized new fronts in Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, and across the Black Sea from Romania and Bulgaria. With so much of its capability already focused on Ukraine, the Russian military would likely become overstretched, leaving large parts of the country vulnerable to invasion. The problem with this scenario is that it seriously risks a no-holds-barred nuclear response. Russian President Vladimir Putin may well have not followed through on any of his various threats of a possible nuclear response in response to the various red lines that Ukraine and its backers have successfully crossed. But none of those, supply of Abrams tanks or long-range missiles, or F-16s for example, pose an existential threat to the nation, and more specifically, Putin's grip on power, at least not in the quantity supplied. The threat posed by NATO forces, amassed overwhelmingly across multiple fronts simultaneously, backed by NATO's vast air superiority, that's an entirely different prospect. Putin has been blunt about what it would take for him to press the big red button, so to speak, and has amended Russia's nuclear doctrine accordingly. In 2018, he told journalist Vladimir Solovyov, "If someone decides to destroy Russia, then we have a legal right to respond. Yes, for humanity, it will be a global catastrophe. For the world, it will be a global catastrophe. But I still, as a citizen of Russia and the head of the Russian state, want to ask the question, why do we need such a world if Russia is not there?" Yes, hawkish voices are dismissing this and similar statements from Putin as bluffing and brinkmanship, but they tend to be sitting in cushy offices in Washington, thousands of miles from where the Sarmats are going to land, or baying Slava Ukraini from their parents' basement. NATO leaders, for the most part, appear to be less reluctant to risk escalation that could quickly spin out of control. Indeed, there are doubts whether certain NATO members, including its primary power, the US, would be willing to honor its Article 5 commitment by sending troops to defend Ukraine in the event of a future attack. The clause leaves some wiggle room for each member to contribute as it deems necessary, and Trump has expressed reservations about the levels of support the US would provide to European NATO members should any of them be attacked. Certainly, as it stands at the end of 2025, NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte and others have made clear that despite its qualitative and quantitative advantage in decisive metrics like advanced fighter jets and surveillance, NATO is not ready for a broad conflict with Russia, even a Russia distracted heavily and taking serious damage in Ukraine. So, while it's very likely that all restrictions on the flow of weapons from NATO members and their use will be lifted as far as is practical, it's debatable which NATO members, if any, would be willing to risk more direct involvement. Failure to act decisively by literally treating an attack on Ukraine as an attack on all of NATO would also undermine NATO itself and will likely deepen fractures within the alliance. Some have argued that the process of fast-tracking Ukraine into NATO itself diminishes the credibility and standing of the alliance. Other members, like Hungary, had to undergo far more rigorous procedures before they were accepted, such as fulfilling a comprehensive membership accession plan, or MAP, which was waived for Ukraine. It's one of the reasons why Hungary has thus far been one of the most vehement opponents of fast-tracking Ukraine into NATO. The US, Germany, Slovakia, Belgium, Slovenia, and Spain have also at different points expressed varying degrees of reservation in this regard. Still, despite the substantive practical impediments to fast-tracking Ukraine into NATO and the severe risks, there are those still calling for it to happen regardless. Veteran defense analyst and consultant Reuben F. Johnson, for example, makes the case in a recent piece for the National Security Journal entitled "Ukraine Must Join NATO." He argues that, as a NATO member, Ukraine will bolster Europe's stability and security and help prevent another war. To his credit, Johnson isn't making these calls from across the Atlantic, nor from a cushy penthouse office, nor grimy basement. He's based in Warsaw, right on NATO's Eastern Front, where he's the director of the Asia Research Center at the Casimir Pulaski Foundation. Citing commentary by the Atlantic Council, he lists 5 reasons why Ukraine must be fast-tracked into NATO post-haste. Firstly, he says, it would mark the end of Russia's never-ending imperial ambitions in Ukraine. This would be the clearest signal to send to Russian President Vladimir Putin that his obsession with erasing all signs of Ukraine as a nation and restoring the Russian Empire will never come to pass, forcing Russia to rethink its appropriate place in the international community. So far, the West's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine have caused Russia to rethink its appropriate place in the international community by doubling and tripling down on building far-reaching relationships with other members of what Johnson calls the authoritarian axis, or axis of upheaval, consisting of North Korea, Iran and China, and dozens of other nations across the global south. This hasn't been good for the West, in the main. Without a clear commitment to actually protect Ukraine with boots on the ground, the more likely signal that this move sends to Putin is to add credence to his claims that NATO expansion into Ukraine is an existential threat to Russia. Rather than forcing Putin to back down in Ukraine, it could easily make things much worse. Ukraine is already a financial basket case, dependent on aid and loans to cover its budget, let alone continuing waging war. As of November 21, 2025, all major thermal and hydroelectric power plants in the country have been damaged by Russian missile and drone attacks, leaving the entire country facing blackouts to a greater or lesser extent, and facing what Zelensky described as the harshest winter coming up. Despite enormous losses, having lumbered its economy into a wartime footing, Russia by every metric still holds an enormous military advantage over Ukraine, whose dogged resistance is being systematically ground down. And yet Russia only formally acknowledged that it's at war in 2024, long after the invasion began, a shift in rhetoric that still falls short of a full legal wartime mobilization and continues to limit the state's ability to commandeer manpower and resources. States at war typically spend 25% or more of their GDP on defense, with Ukraine spending 36.7% of its GDP on defense in 2023 and set to spend 31% in 2025. By contrast, Russia's defense spending during the war has hovered between 5 and 7% of GDP, and it only has a debt-to-GDP ratio of around 20%. Put it all together, and rather than enhancing European security, bulldozing Ukraine into NATO now, when a clear willingness to enforce Article 5 emphatically is anything but certain, risks disastrous consequences for Ukraine and an underprepared NATO beyond. A second reason for fast-tracking Ukraine into NATO, and the most important according to Johnson, is that Ukraine now has Europe's largest, most capable and most innovative military. It has literally rewritten the book on how to neutralize a large, more powerful and resource-rich enemy, he says. The rapidly deteriorating situation along several sectors of the front in eastern Ukraine suggests that the notion that Ukraine has neutralized Russia was lifted directly from the Trump Manual on Political Embellishment. However, he does have a point when it comes to the value that Ukraine's battle-hardened troops could bring to NATO. Firstly, they would swell the NATO ranks considerably. NATO has a combined 3.44 million active military personnel, falling to 2.11 million without the United States. If Ukraine were to join NATO, the alliance military total would increase to 4.32 million, i.e. roughly by a third. But that's far from the only value that Ukrainian forces would add. BBC Ukraine recently reported that Ukrainian servicemen sent for training in NATO countries were less than impressed with the instruction they received, referring to it as preparing for the war of the past without drones. Another quipped, "They continue to teach in Grunwald textbooks," referring to the famous Polish victory at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410. In one particularly cringeworthy episode, an instructor reportedly asked the Ukrainians to remove their drone from a drill because it was spoiling the tactics. If the Ukrainian soldiers' accounts of their NATO training are accurate, it's clear that in various respects, NATO's existing methods and tactics are no longer applicable, at least to the high-tech drone-saturated trench warfare prevalent in eastern Ukraine. Rather than Ukraine raising its standards to meet NATO's, it might well be a case of the Ukrainians providing the expertise across the alliance. To an extent, we've already seen this with the opening of a facility for Ukrainian drone operators to train NATO operators in Poland. Johnson and other hawks also believe that admitting Ukraine to NATO would most likely prevent Russia from continuing its hostile activities in other European nations. Maybe it'll spark World War III. Johnson also believes that Ukraine would most likely be the most committed and dedicated member of the alliance, and that this is a compelling reason to ignore all the issues outlined earlier and fast-track it into NATO. Roughly 3/4 of Ukrainian citizens support NATO membership, he says, a higher percentage than the populations of most long-time alliance states. The implication seems to be that this support is reason enough to throw due diligence out the window and roll out the red carpet. In doing so, Johnson believes it would send a message that would dispel the cynicism and derision in the global community about NATO's weakness of unity. It's hard to understand whether hawks like Johnson don't understand the many serious risks of fast-tracking Ukraine into NATO, as outlined earlier, or do and have dismissed them. It's incredibly dangerous. There's a greater chance that Trump announces he's from another planet than that Russia not viewing Ukraine's accession into NATO as an extreme escalation. Such a move is much more likely to risk a pan-European confrontation with Russia that both sides have made clear they're not ready for. That in itself ratchets up the risk of either side feeling desperate enough to pull the nuclear trigger. Moreover, support for Ukraine's membership in NATO and direct involvement by NATO or member nations is not high and waning across NATO's lands. Pushing membership through an expedited way risks large-scale political, social, and economic upheaval in nations like France, the UK, and Germany, whose respective leadership already enjoys among the lowest popularity in their nation's long histories. Fast-track NATO membership, on the face of it, would appear to be a Ukrainian dream, massively relieving their military burden and providing a genuine chance for them to reclaim their lost lands. But all things considered, it could well turn into a screen door on a submarine for the embattled nation instead. It could be that powerful security guarantees not linked to NATO, similar to the ones envisaged in Trump's 28-point plan, are more effective and much less risky. By not joining NATO, Ukraine would deprive Putin of one of his major narratives and force him to expose his true intentions. A small but strategic victory that may pay diplomatic dividends down the road as they're revealed. Now, if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel and enable notifications so you don't miss out on the latest military news and analysis about NATO, Ukraine, and beyond. Thanks for watching.